my perspective, does she need to borrow that, or you
I
have
mean,
no perspective?
it's not important what I say to the people.
Well, you're live.
Okay, hi. Welcome to A New Way. My name is Victoria. We are very excited tonight to have a wonderful speaker with us, Janet Cobb. Before we get to that, we're just going to open in some prayer really quick. All right.
Yep.
Oh, I can do it unless you want
Okay,
to.
go for it.
All right, you want to?
No?
Okay. Dear God, thank you for bringing us all together here today. We are, opening our hearts and opening up our ears and minds to hear how it really means to be holy. There's so many different ways, and God, we know that you are perfection and you love each of us for ourselves. So thank you for bringing us here, and thank you for allowing us to hear this message. All right, so without further ado, I will introduce to you Janet Cobb.
Thanks. Thank you. That's so kind. That's so kind. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I named the title of this talk, Surviving Sanctity, off of a book that I wrote called Surviving Sanctity, which is my memoir of 13 years in a Catholic convent. I was a nun for 13 years. And tonight I'd like to share a bit of my story, but more as a reflection on what Victoria sort of referenced in her prayer, which is, what does it mean to be holy? Or, is there only one way to be holy? So I hope that in sharing my story, you all are able to reflect on your own stories and if anything resonates. And then I do have a few questions to prompt a conversation at the end, if you'd like, however you want to do it. So I would normally, when I do a talk, say that I was a teacher for 20-some years, and I have 3 children, and so I'm very used to interruptions. So feel free to, chime in or anything if that so suits your environment. Okay, so I do have a few note cards just to help guide, because I'm 59 years old and I'm talking about my life, so I could go on and on. So just to guide and give a little framework. So I'd like to start with what I've sort of begun to realize are stages in this journey of faith. And the stages often coincide with life stages, and then sometimes there are stages that get sort of thrown out of whack, right, because of life events. So I'm going to share sort of my life stages. I have a name for each one. It just so happens that I like to alliterate, so I have 5 R's. So we're going to go through the 5 R's of sort of holiness or sanctity or faith journey, that sort of thing. Okay? So the first one is rites and rules, rituals, that sort of thing. And that usually happens when we're all little, right? We're all born into these rites and these rituals and these things. And so for me, I was the 7th child of 8, a family of 8 children in a Catholic home in the 60s and 70s. So if anybody here knows anything about that, that means there were crucifixes and pictures of Mary and Sacred Hearts with lights coming out of them. And in my home, there were also the little holy water fonts by every light switch. And then my mother added on the daily rosary. So we prayed the rosary every day. And then on the calendar that was on the wall, every 6 weeks was confession. So we did every 6 weeks we did confession. And then on certain Wednesdays we did novenas to Our Lady of Perpetual Help and adoration at church. And then during the Lent, we added the stations on Friday after the rosary. And on Sunday, we added the litany after the rosary, right? I entered a convent at 18, and some people joked that I did it to get out of my mother's cloister, right? Like, religion. I went to a Catholic school, but at the same time, I lived in a neighborhood where most people weren't Catholic, which is not real common in those days, especially if you're from the Midwest. I'm from California. But in the Midwest, they were like Catholic neighborhoods, right? But I had exposure to all sorts of other, mostly Christian, but faith traditions. So I knew there was more out there, but didn't matter. They were Protestant, and we were Catholic, and that's what mattered. And then I had a few moments, right? I think there are always what I call defining moments in our faith journeys. And some of mine that I'd like to share. The first one is when I was about 12, so I was in Catholic school, and there was a bit of death around me. I was the seventh of 8, right? So older siblings had spouses dying already, and they were young, mind you, but I was little, so I thought old people died, right? They were like in their 20s, but death was around me, and then I was studying the lives of the saints, because that's what you do in Catholic grade school, and Maria Goretti was a 12-year-old who gave her life so she wouldn't have sex, which really, really bizarre kind of framing for a little kid, but anyway, for whatever reason, I thought I was dying. So I went to my mom, and I'm like, oh, in my head, I'm like, oh, I need to write my autobiography, because if I'm dying, there's some purpose in my life, because God has a purpose for all of it, a lot of real mixed up messages in there. And I went to my mom, and I said, hey, could you tell me some stories about when I was a baby? Now, I should have probably said this somewhere before 12 years old. When I was about 7, my father left my mother with her 8 children. So I said, from before Dad left. So tell me stories from before Dad left, because I didn't really remember much. And she started telling me the story about when I was 2. She said, when you were about 2, I took all the other kids to Faith at Play, but you were too young, so we went to the ice cream shop. And while we were at the ice cream shop, you stood under the umbrella and looked up at the sky and said, I wonder why I have to go to heaven. And here I am at 12 thinking I'm dying and need to write my autobiography, and my mother says this to me, and she says, and then you said, I guess Daddy will have to take me to heaven. Right? So, right? And then she said, and then when you were like 6 or 7, she says, do you remember? And I said, remember what? And when she said it, then a lot of memories started coming back. When I was about 6 or 7, I used to, whenever my siblings, 7th of 8, would make fun of me, which they did a lot, because I had a lisp, and I didn't like to eat chocolate, so I ate fairy tip cake, like just all the things. I used to say, you make fun of me because I have to go to heaven and you don't. So then, from then on, I just sort of said, okay, Mom. And I didn't let on anything to her. I went to my room, and my mind started going, how little kids' minds do. And I was just convinced that I was going to die before I did anything. Oh, and one other story. When I was 3, after the ice cream parlor and before I have to go to heaven and you don't, my mother was giving us all a bath. The 3 of us, there were 3 of us in a row, Karen, Tina, Janet, right? She was giving us a bath, and she said, what are you going to do when you grow up? And Karen said, I'm going to be a mommy. And Tina said, I'm going to be like Regina, our oldest sister. And before I could say anything, Karen said, Janet's going to heaven. Right? So there's all this stuff around me going to heaven, right? So then, 12 years old, I think I'm dying. And instead of then becoming very holy, I went the opposite. And I started being a hellion, right? And I did all the things, right? All the things, so much so that at 15, right before I turned 16, when I was still convinced I was going to die, I drank enough to almost kill myself. I should have died. I should have died. I drank so much that night, I should be dead. But I didn't die. Instead, I woke up on the living room floor in the pants I wore to the homecoming game and not the dress I had for the homecoming dance. Anybody from the 70s, 80s know what that means? We used to have games that everybody wore pants, and then we'd get dresses to go to the dance, and I was still in my football game clothes, and I had no clue what had happened. None at all. And I'm like, okay, so I'm surrounded by newspapers, and I'm still in my game clothes, and my mother, who always slept on the couch so that she would stop any burglar who tried to come in before they could get to the kids, was there on the couch. And I'm like, what happened? And as I stood up, of course I couldn't. I was so weak. So I started crawling up the stairs to my bedroom, and on the landing of our stairs, I stopped and I said, God, I'm done living like this. I can't do this anymore. I'm giving my life back to you. Whatever that meant. But I was 15, I was almost 16. And so from then on, I started doing more religion, right? I started going to, well, I never could not go to church, but I started paying attention more during the rosary, and I started going to Bible studies and retreats with Christian Teen Encounter Christ groups and all of this, and I sort of grew in my faith to the point that at 18, I decided to enter a convent, okay? But before that, just before, this is how children's minds in faith work, they started talking about the draft. They started talking about drafting women. And I said, no big deal, at the age of 17. No big deal. If they really start to draft women because I am a pacifist, I am anti-war, right? I will either enter a convent or get pregnant. And to me, they were equally valid. Equally valid because they would both keep me from doing something that I was totally against, which was war, right? So I had a boyfriend that I could very easily convince that I needed to get pregnant if it came to that, right? That would have been no objections on his part. But that didn't happen, so it sort of fell by the wayside, and within about 6 months, I had graduated high school. I went to visit a friend who had entered a convent, and that day I decided that I needed to enter this convent. To my family's chagrin, to my teachers, the nuns' chagrin, everybody tried to convince me not to do this. And of course, I always wanted to buck the system, so I went ahead and I did it. And a few days in, I started to realize that I wasn't sure I made the right decision. But what happened was I got to the second stage. So the first one was rituals and rules, and what happens when you get confronted with something that makes you think, oh, did I make a wrong decision or whatever, I went all into the rigidity and the fundamentalism of it, right? And I said, I got to do this. And when I started to question the men in charge, the sister in charge, said, you cannot question because I am the voice of God for you now. And I accepted you, and you are in training, so... And I was 18, and all I wanted to do was be holy and do God's will. So when she became the voice of God's will for me, everything was what she said. So I went all in on the rules. As much as I tried to resist them, she just kept hammering away that she was the voice of God. And a good appetite is a sign of a good vocation, so you better eat that cookie. Or you might lose your vocation, right? This was stuff that was said to me day in and day out. They had me do this is another weird kind of thing. She had a sister who was doing psych training and needed a group of people for a battery of tests, which ethically is probably really, really questionable, but they tested all of us in this training program, right? And I tested at the genius level. So now in addition to being God's voice, she added the pride was the devil's downfall. And your intelligence will be your downfall. Yeah. I soaked it all in. I had to be humble. I had to be this. I had to be that. And then I stayed in this rigidity, this fundamentalism, to the point that I did not nice things to my family. I have a brother who became a Baptist minister. I couldn't acknowledge his ordination. Sorry. I had a sister who got married, but she wasn't marrying in the church, so I couldn't acknowledge, right? So to be holy, to do God's will, I started doing all kinds of things that were against my nature, right? And I kept doing that, and then I spent a year, I went and did my first vows, even though every time I started to question, she would say things like, idle hands are the devil's workshop. Go keep busy and stop thinking. And when I had really close friends, that boyfriend who could have easily gotten me pregnant, committed suicide. And when I cried, she told me, tears are a lack of faith in God. Right. So I didn't cry. I stopped showing emotion. And then I spent a year in Oregon where my whole focus was on being obedient and being humble, because that's what Sister Andre said I needed to be. And then I was sent to Taiwan, and all of a sudden, there were people in the world who were good people who didn't believe in Jesus. And it was like, thank you. It was like, wait, it's Easter, and nobody here is paying any attention. It's Christmas, and nobody here is paying any attention, right? And so that just started opening my eyes, and then, going to the temple, the Confucius temples and the rituals and the altars and all of this, and I was just like, there is so much more out there. There is so much more out there. Spent a year in Taiwan, went to Hong Kong, started back to school, because I had entered in high school, right? So I had done a little bit of AA, but I hadn't gotten my full degree. I was sent there to become a teacher at University of Hong Kong. My world broadened even more, right? All kinds of different people, all kinds of different things. Then Tiananmen Square, anybody remember that? Tiananmen Square happened, and I marched in the marches, and I was a teacher at school, so we brought the kids, and it was all about, social justice and, all these things. Then I came home for a visit after I made my final vows. Came home for a visit and found out, I came to Chicago for the first time in my life, met some relatives of mine, drove downstate, Quad Cities, is that downstate? I don't know. Quad Cities, met my dad's relatives, and found out that this man who I had never heard from again from the time I was about 7, had been living there the whole time, and they had been lying to us about not knowing where he was, and he had a whole family, and And when I went back to Hong Kong, none of the world made sense, because I had been the abandoned girl who died to herself so dad could be my dad. I had spiritualized all the daddies taking me to heaven from when I was 2 to God being my father who took my dad so that he could be my dad. And children's minds, right? So things started to not make sense. And then my body started to fall apart. And then other people started dying, and I started seeing the realities of the women who had trained me being not God's voice, not anything holy or special, but just women who were struggling and who were, in many ways, just in far too much detail that I could give tonight, really, really dysfunctional, right? And some of the key things that sort of was like, wait, what? Was that woman who had been my voice of God was now living in Hong Kong with me. And when I came back from the doctor to tell her that the doctor in fact said that I wasn't dying of cancer, right? But it was something else that was far more easy to handle, she said, well, I'm not your superior, why are you telling me? Right? So she any concern she had shown was because she had to, right? Because she was the one in charge of me for all those years. So it was this mix of emotion, this mix of politics, this mix of seeing the movie Dances with Wolves, which is a whole other aside, but was life-changing for me, and that comes up in a minute, and I know I'm a little over time, but... Okay. I just knew things weren't right. But what I did again was I spiritualized it, and I did believe, and I had always believed, that we didn't live the Franciscan life that we were claiming to live as profoundly as I thought we should. That was a lot of my questions along the way. I'd go see the movie Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon and come back and say, why aren't we living poverty and why aren't we doing this? And they're like, oh, well, the Bible says, you'll get rewards. And I'm like, that's supposed to be in heaven. And they're like, no, it's here, right? Like, I had never had a steak in my life until I entered the convent. It's like, how is this poverty, right? Like, so there was all these questions, right? All these questions. But then I got to a point where it's like, I believed that God was calling me to live among the people on the street. And the convent people wouldn't let me explore it. And they kept sending me to all these priests to get guidance. And all the priests were like, yep, if that's what you think God's calling you to do, you better do it. And they just kept sending me to, they don't know what they're talking about, and they'd send me to more. and it was like, So finally the new superior general who had taken over from that previous one said, can you please come back to the States and let me help you discern God's will? A little improvement, right? Until it wasn't, because in her discernment, she asked me at one point in this whole process to pray about something. They wanted to send me to teach 6th grade in San Francisco, blah, blah, blah. And I said, these are 6 reasons why you shouldn't do this. But if you believe that it's the best thing, then I am living in a vow of obedience, I will do it. Which she later turned into, we wouldn't have done it had you not volunteered. Right, so lots of that sort of stuff went on until the point when I realized this just was not working. I needed to trust myself more than all these other people, right? And so in 1994, I left the convent. And then I got to this stage that I would call, from the rigidity to the relaxation a little bit, right? I started living faith and religion my way, not anybody else's way, not the church's way, not, right? I got married in the church. I stayed Catholic, had 3 kids, raised them kind of Catholic, right? I mean, they were baptized. They went to some Catholic schools. I taught in Catholic schools the entire time. So I was still Catholic, but I wasn't rigid. I wasn't, And then, for various reasons that I definitely won't go into, my career imploded. And I decided, as I walked out of the office of the Catholic schools superintendent, that I would never work for the church again. By that afternoon, I said I would never have a boss again. And then I went about my business trying to recreate my life. And in that process of once again sort of grieving the whole, disillusionment and all of this, because I was 48 or something by this time, it was 2015. And my entire life had been tied up in the church. And I watched the movie Spotlight. The movie that demonstrates how the Boston newspaper company took down the cardinals and the bishops in the church that had covered up the sex abuse scandals, right? Now, I had been in the convent. I knew all about the scandals, but it was always, well, that's those people, that's not the faith, that's not the, right? You got to separate the people from the faith. And I had spent years sort of making excuses. And when I sat there that night, binge watching all sorts of TV, and Spotlight came on, and I watched it, and I watched these systematic, intentional evil. I had this moment. And it was, if I affiliate with this institution, then I am condoning it, right? So I can't do that anymore. And I didn't make a big deal of it, but the next day someone happened to ask me if I was Catholic, and I said no. Now, some of my family members, if you ask, is Dan a Catholic? They'd all say yeah, because I don't care. I'm not going to make a big deal of it. I don't go to church. I haven't been to church for 100 years. I went to my mother's funeral, and my kids came with me. My mother, right, the rosary every day, Catholic, the cloister Catholic. At her funeral mass, I didn't go to communion. And my kids said, Mom, did you murder somebody? Why would you not go to communion? Because I had always gone to communion. Everybody had gone to communion because you just go to communion, right? You don't think, and I said, no, it just doesn't mean anything to me anymore. It just doesn't mean anything to me. So I reached the point when the person asked me if I was Catholic and I said no, I reached the point of rejection, just totally rejecting the church. And it started with the institution, not the faith, right? The institution, not the faith. And then I started being like, how did I ever believe that? How did I ever believe that? And so then the theology started to drop away, and then the rituals started to drop away, and the piety, and then the customs, right? And it's just has all sort of fallen away. And then, just recently, I'd say, maybe the last 6 months, I've begun to say I've reached what I call the next stage, which is reclamation. And by that I mean, I'm not going to let any institution or people or anything take away from me that which is meaningful to me. But I get to decide what that is. And it's certainly not anything that right now is an institutional religion. But what it is I will to anyone who's starting to talk about, original sin or this, whatever, all the rules about sin, I direct them to Matthew Fox's Original Blessing. If you haven't read that book, read it, right? St. Augustine is the idiot who drove the church into this original sin madness. Prior to that, there were many, many theologians who talked about original blessing, and it just got totally washed away, right? Matthew 25:31, the last judgment, I will always feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit those in prison, right? I will live that. I don't care if it's Matthew 25:31 or any other thing, but it is, those things are common to all faiths. Those things are what good people do. I don't have to be a Christian to do those things, right? So I will reclaim those as my banner or whatever, right? The golden rule, the platinum rule, you know the difference. The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The platinum rule is do unto others as they want to have done to them, right? So I have gone through the 5 R's of ritual and rules, rigidity, relaxation, rejection, reclamation. And so that's what I would invite all of you to think about on your own journeys as, you know, do you have similar stories? Do you have a similar pattern? Where are you in those 5 R's? So that is my story of surviving sanctity as I thought it was when I was mad because I had to go to heaven and no one else did, to today. So I hope that that is helpful for you and that you have some discussion around that. So thank you.
Why don't you go up and do a quick prayer and then we'll go off.
Okay. Oh, I get a mic. Thank you.
Yeah, because they're recording.
It works.
Got it in your pocket.
You're going to be pulled off, and that's really sad. So I'm just going to do a brief prayer before we go into discussion. Dear Lord, thank you for this opportunity to hear the message. It gives us a lot of thought as to what path we each have taken in our lives, and even that journey of what the ritual and all those things that many of us went through as children, and how it doesn't necessarily mean what we were taught it meant. And those leaders in the faith that would tell us that they were the person that was telling us what should and shouldn't be done, whether it was in Catholic Church or in some other faith tradition. Lord, help us to recognize when the true faith that we should be doing and the true works that we should be doing are about how Jesus lived and how he has recommended we live our lives, and that's way more important than did you go to church on this particular day, were you baptized, and all these other things. Lord, help us to live as you would live, as you would have us live. Lord, we ask all of these things in your name. Amen. Amen. And we will go to discussion.